And to discuss the key takeaway, as well as what else could we expect this summer, we are joined by our next guest, Joshua Huminski, Director of Mike Rogers Centers for Intelligence and Global Affairs. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So, the level of defense spending was discussed during the defense ministers' summit last week, and here we have 2% of GDP is the minimum, yet not all member states are doing that. Now, some NATO members are saying that spending should be more like 2.5–3%. Now, what, in your opinion, what is an appropriate level, and why should NATO members spend more?
The 2% commitment of GDP spending is a good signal to both what the United States and Russia in particular about the commitment of countries to supporting defense and deterrence across the NATO alliance. The question isn't so much what the 2% or the 2% target, it's more about what the 2% is spent on. And that is a better measure of actual defense capability and deterrence against Russia right now.
Right, so let me ask you about a different aspect of what was agreed upon during this meeting. Essentially, Hungary is no longer going to interfere, right? So I would say that this is a huge positive development. What is your take on that? And I mean, will they keep their word?
Absolutely. It is a good step forward, and it is a credit to Stoltenberg for getting the agreement there where Hungary will not be standing in the way of NATO activities. And it's indicative of the diplomatic friction that is going to happen amongst an alliance that has as many members as it does. It's important to remember that these sorts of frictions have happened in the past and workarounds have been achieved. Hopefully, the Prime Minister Orban will stick to his word, and certainly Stoltenberg will stick to NATO's word. But it is a step forward and indicative of the progress that is being made to providing support to Ukraine over the longer term.
Now, we also found out that NATO is set to take the leading role when it comes to coordinating defense for Ukraine from the United States. Now, what does it entail, do you think? Can you tell us more about that?
I think it's important to consider the fact that European commitments to Ukraine and European aid to Ukraine has increased and almost reached parity with the United States if you look at everything in aggregate. And that is a fantastic step forward and progress in providing the assistance that Kyiv needs. On the military side, the United States is the only country that has the stockpiles and the resources to provide this substantive military aid in terms of air defense, in terms of equipment, in terms of things like the HIMARS and the ATACMS systems, long-range ballistic and cruise missiles, that Ukraine needs. So NATO taking over the coordination function is a signal of progress, I think. Is going to allow the NATO member states to better coordinate aid, to better deconflict aid, which has been happening on a bilateral basis between member states and Ukraine specifically. It's important to remember that NATO is not a party to this conflict, but the member states are providing support to Ukraine to defend itself and hopefully in the future make progress and offensive gains.
Right, and speaking about the support for Ukraine, apparently Jens Stoltenberg is trying to get a 40 billion commitment a year from NATO members, and this is already down from 100 billion. So will this be achieved, and do you think that this will help Ukraine advance its efforts and ultimately win the war?
I think having the long-term commitments that the 40 billion is indicative of is absolutely critical to Ukraine's long-term defense and potential progress towards some definition of victory. As we saw in the United States, the supplemental delay in Congress for the $60 billion complicated Ukraine's ability to do mid to long-term defense planning. And what Ukraine needs is multi-year commitments over the longer term so that they can plan better for defensive operations and eventually offensive activities. And I think this 40 billion a year target is achievable. It's pretty much what is being spent right now. It is a step down from the 100 billion that he had articulated before. And I think that delta of that $60 billion is certainly less, so just numerically, obviously, but it reflects the fact that the countries that are committing to support Ukraine are more tolerant of that 40 billion as opposed to the 100 billion, which is a much further target.
Mm-hmm. Now, we just spoke about the Swiss Peace Summit that came to an end yesterday. And there, we saw leaders supporting Ukraine. And I think that didn't change over the years that the war in Ukraine has been happening. But these are just the nice words and, signatories, and they over 90 countries signed a joint communique. But also, President Zelensky said that Ukraine needs more weapons. Now, my question to you is, with the help that Ukraine is receiving from their Western allies, is Ukraine able to prevail this war in the long run? Is Ukraine able to actually push Russia back and win this war? Because it seems that peace summits like this is not going to really work if Russia is not in agreement with Ukraine and other allies. What is your take on that?
Absolutely. The definition for victory has fundamentally shifted, and we're in a situation where 3 years into the war now, it is unclear as to what is a militarily achievable, politically viable outcome. Certainly the military aid that has gone to Ukraine has enabled it to achieve marked success. If we look at from the opening days of the war, Ukraine has retaken 50% of the territory that Russia initially held. That is a significant gain. But what does ultimate victory look like in Ukraine remains unclear. Is it returning to the February 2022 borders? Is it retaking Crimea? Is it somewhere in between? And unfortunately, and ultimately, it is going to come down to the battlefield conditions that set the stage for a diplomatic resolution. And I don't believe we've reached that position yet. Certainly not from Kyiv's perspective, and most certainly not from Russia's perspective, where you have President Putin largely believes he is in a position of strength. It is a slow offensive progression and taking territory that Russia thinks that it is winning this conflict right now. And the commitments by NATO member states, by the United States, to provide additional aid and long-term support will hopefully change that calculus within Moscow and drive President Putin to a negotiating position of some sort that is palatable for both President Zelensky and President Putin.
Right, and Jens Stoltenberg said that the whole idea, right, is to minimize the risk of gaps and delays, as we saw earlier this year. And of course, he was referring to the 60 billion being held up in Congress. But however, is this realistic? In a sense, I mean, we have a lot of political changes coming up later this year, perhaps a different US president of all things, quite an important shift and a possible one for that. Will we see the leaders making these schemes more foolproof, more able to work, irregardless of who is in power? Can we see that kind of shift happening?
I think that's what you've seen with the shift to NATO's coordination of aid to Ukraine, the long-term commitments of aid to Ukraine, as well as the bilateral agreements between the United States, Ukraine, United Kingdom, and Ukraine, and other countries and Ukraine. The idea is to make that long-term in nature and almost ring of fence both the material support, but also the political support to Ukraine. Certainly, if you look at it from the Kremlin's calculus in Russia, the hope is that changes in government, both in the United States, across Europe, the United Kingdom, could potentially signal some change in support levels to Ukraine. But the activities that the current governments are taking, both President Biden, Prime Minister Sunak, and others, is very much designed to prevent that change from potentially happening and see some sort of long-term support and aid to Kyiv continue.
But even if you look at the countries that are willing to support Ukraine for longer, realistically, I mean, are Central Eastern European countries, are we able to support Ukraine and also secure our own countries in the area? Because this is, security and military security is very expensive endeavor. So is the region able to provide for Ukraine as well as for themselves?
That's a very good question, and I think that's why you saw that 100 billion euro walk back to the 40 billion euro target from Stoltenberg. And you're absolutely right. If you look at Poland's defense spending, which is 3.9% of GDP, which is absolutely incredible, the investments that Poland is making in its defense posture and defense and security, and also border security posture, that is a very expensive proposition. And better coordination of the aid from Brussels to Ukraine through the coordination mechanism will hopefully ease some of that burden. And to your opening question about the 2% target, if you can get more of the NATO members to that 2% target as a floor, not a ceiling, and if you can get better coordination of the overall defense spending in alignment with the regional defense plans that were approved at the 2023 Vilnius summit, you can hopefully offset some of the imbalances that exist within the alliance, better coordinate the spending, and achieve better overall defense and deterrence, rather than having countries on the front line, such as Poland and Eastern European states, bearing more of the brunt than other countries that are members of NATO.
Well, we are approaching Washington, NATO summit in Washington, so perhaps new ideas and new thresholds will be announced over there. Joshua Huminski, director of Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs, was our guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.